see everybody this morning. Thanks for coming out on a pretty dreary morning. I'm sure you guys have questions on a lot of things. One thing that I kind of wanted to fill everybody in on is where we are in the budget. Some of you were there the other night when I spoke about the budget. As you know, I'm the chairman of the Senate Appropriations Committee. And the way the budget works, the governor gives us his budget when he does his State of the State. We don't know what's in his budget before that. Literally, his staff gives us those budget books while he's making that speech on that night. And so we're still going through those books. Some of them are actually still at the printer. But the way that works is you take the governor's budget. That's the budget that the governor proposes. It's what he wants to see for the state of Missouri for the upcoming fiscal year. And remember, we budget on a fiscal year. So our fiscal year starts July 1st. So the budget that we are working on right now, once it's done, will start July 1st and go to the end of the following June. So once the governor gives us that budget, it's taken by subject matter and put into House bills. Mostly House Bill 1 through 13. It goes over to the House Budget Committee. They look at what the governor wanted. They look at what they want to do. They can do whatever they want. They don't have to follow the governor. And the committee gets that done. They take it out to the floor of the House. The House passes it. It comes over to the Senate. It comes to my committee and the Appropriations Committee. We then look at what the governor asked for. We look at what the House did. We can go with the governor. We can go with the House. We can do something completely different. When we get that done in committee, we take it out to the Senate floor. I take all those bills on the Senate floor and pass all of them. When we have a disagreement between the House and the Senate, which frequently happens, and that's really where the budget generally gets worked out, there's 5 senators and 5 representatives that make up a conference committee. And we go into a room, and it's subject to the Sunshine Law. It's a room like this. We have a big table. And it's very contentious. The room's packed with people, and we sit there and we fight about budget items. And as the chairman, I'm always on the conference committee. The vice chairman is always on the conference committee. The ranking minority member from the Democrat Party is always on the conference committee. Then there's 2 at-large members. And that's the way both for the House and the Senate. When we get that budget done, because we've probably changed some things in that conference committee, it's got to go back to the House and the Senate, be passed again. Once we get that done, we give it back to the governor. The governor's got a couple options. He can line item veto things in the budget. Remember, those budget bills are the only thing the governor can line item veto. All other bills that we give the governor, he's got to take or leave the entire bill. But the budget bills, and literally when you think about these budget bills, it'll say, you know, Department of Social Services. And then it has a line for every single program. It tells you how many employees there are, how much money's going into the program, how much is for fringe and benefits, all those types of things. He can go through any one of those lines and veto a line. He can't change the number. He can't reduce a number. He can't increase a number. He can veto the line, though, if he wants. What's happened the last 3 years, the governor generally has not done that because there's some political liability that comes with vetoing something because it gets a lot of media attention. So what the governor's done is just take the budget that we give him on certain things and then just not release the money that we appropriated. The governor really doesn't have the authority to do that. The governor's got a couple options. After he gets that budget, like I said, he can line item veto, he can agree, sign it, that he agrees to those lines in the budget. The other thing, because we have a balanced budget amendment in this state, we cannot spend more in a given fiscal year than we bring in. There's an escape valve in the Missouri Constitution that allows the governor to reduce lines when the state of Missouri is not going to bring in enough money to meet budget. That's never happened, and at least that I know of. It's not going to happen again. So that doesn't give the governor the option to reduce lines like he's been doing because we've made budget and we will make budget. The other thing the governor can do is control the rate of expenditure. So when we say money goes to a given program, throughout the 4 quarters of the fiscal year, he can control the release rate of that money. Traditionally, the way it's always been done in the state of Missouri is 40% is released in the first quarter to the agency, and then 20-20-20. It's not written in stone. The governor doesn't have to do it that way. But on certain programs, I'll give you an example. For higher education, for this fiscal year that we're halfway through right now, the 2012 fiscal year, the governor had a 7% cut for higher education. So in the conference committee, Chris Kelly and I put about $20 million more into the budget. We took the governor's 7% cut for higher education to about a 5% cut. We gave the budget back to the governor. He didn't line item veto that, but he just took that money, that extra money, and he won't release it. he has no legal authority to do that. Not only did he take everybody back up to a 7% cut, he took the University of Missouri to an 8% cut, because in the intervening time frame while we were working on the budget, the university, seeing what the governor had proposed, raised tuition. They went to the Commissioner of Higher Education, they followed all the legal procedures that they were supposed to do, and the governor still said, his public statement was, I didn't like their tuition increase, so I'm giving them an extra 1% cut. Everybody in this room needs to understand, there's no legal authority to do that. He just did it. Now, most of you know Tom Schweik, the auditor, is suing the governor. That's what his lawsuit is about. His lawsuit is not about this is the right amount of money or that's the right amount of money. His lawsuit is simply about the constitutional principle that the governor does not have the level of control over the budget that he's been exercising. And that is to just disagree with the General Assembly on what we appropriate for certain things and just not release the money. You can't do that. Now, in response to that lawsuit, what he's done, he's gone into court in Cole County, and he said, oh, I'm not withholding anything. I'm just controlling the rate of expenditure, which I can do. But obviously, there's a point where that just gets silly, because if you hold something until the very end and release it on the last day, and then tell the agency, just hold on to that for the start of the next year that starts the next day, you're effectively manipulating the budget in a way that the Constitution doesn't allow. So, we'll see where the auditor's case goes. As the chairman of the Senate Appropriations Committee, I spend almost all my time on the budget. The Appropriations Committee meets nonstop. We meet way more than any other Senate committee. Most Senate committees meet about once a week for about an hour. We meet pretty much in the Appropriations Committee every single hour that we are not on the floor when we are down there. And it gets much worse as we go on towards the end of the budget process. I mean, we go 2 or 3 in the morning. It's a lot of hours. And as the chairman, I probably put in twice as many hours as everybody else on the committee. So it's a big commitment. That being said, I still file a lot of bills. Rex, how we doing? I see your video.
Fine. I'll let you know at 10.
Okay. I file a lot of bills on top of that, and I'm happy to talk about any of those. But real quick on the budget, we're using the number. We've got about a $500 million budget shortfall this year. The reason that is, back when the economy got bad in 2008, and halfway through the fiscal year in 2009 is when the federal government started sending states that stabilization money. The stabilization money, different from the stimulus money. The stimulus money was supposed to go out there and spur jobs. The stabilization money went to state governments to go into operating budgets so that state governments would not, basically eliminate or reduce programs, social services, education, all those things. So, Missouri got just over $2 billion in the time frame that we got it. But in the fiscal year that we're in right now, 2012, there's $400 million in the operating budget for this year that is the tail end of that stabilization money. So for 2013, the budget we're working on, it goes from 400 this year to 0 next year. 200 million of that 400 million is in the K through 12 funding budget. So if that gives you some example, we have to find, just to keep K through 12 flat for 13, we have to find 200 million of general revenue to plug in to fill that hole. So that's 400 million short for 2013. Also, as part of the stabilization, the Medicaid reimbursement rates changed a slight bit in the federal government. Generally, it's about 60-40. On Medicaid, the state pays 40% out of general revenue, and the federal government pays the other 60%. They paid a little bit more than that for a couple years. That ends for 2013. So it's about another $100 million for Medicaid increases. I think that's a conservative number. It's probably closer to 2. So it's at least $500 million, okay? So we have to fill that with discretionary general revenue, which comes from income taxes. On top of that, just so everybody knows this as well, the high watermark for general revenue in the state of Missouri, and remember, you've all heard me talk about the budget. The general revenue is that 1/3 of the state's $23 billion budget that comes in through income taxes mostly, to a lesser degree sales tax, and it doesn't have any strings attached to it.
1 minute. Okay,
we can decide where to spend it. About $3 billion goes to public education, about $3 billion goes to Medicaid, that's almost all of it, and then the rest goes to prisons and some other things. 2008 was the high water mark for general revenue. It's about $8.6 billion, okay? We dropped almost $2 billion from 2008 to 2010. We're coming back up now, but we are still about $1 billion short in general revenue from where we were in 2008. So when people say, $500 Funding for public education, what's the problem? What's the problem? That's the problem. General revenue is down, and on top of that, federal government requires us to spend more and more money every year on Medicaid, and that comes from that discretionary general revenue. I know you're going to have lots of questions. I wanted to give an update on the budget. Rex is telling me my time's up. Thanks, and we'll take questions in a minute.
Hey. I want to be careful about something before I start. Kurt is my friend. I treasure that friendship. I want none of you to tie anything that I say to Kurt. Because I'm going to say some things you're not going to like, and I don't want him to, I don't need to blame him for those things. Let me say two things first about what he just said. I agree with him that the governor should not have the power to do what he calls expenditure restriction. I'm not sure that he doesn't have the power. I don't have his certainty as to whether he legally does or doesn't. I don't think he should, but I think he might. The Schweik suit will resolve that question. I've thought a couple of years now about offering legislation to make it clear that he does not. Governor can do two things. I think he should be allowed to do two things. One is veto. Veto's okay. Disagree, fight about it, override the veto or don't override the veto. Second is withhold to make sure you don't spend more than is available. Absolutely correct in our system of having a balanced budget. He has exercised a third authority that Kurt articulated. That is, he does expenditure restrictions, he calls them. And the effect of those are to be that he makes legislative decisions. He decides how much should be spent here rather than there. And the way he's done that is there is a series of estimated lines in the budget called E's. Every governor abuses E's to some extent. Current governor has driven huge trucks through the E's. And this is without regard to philosophy. Over the past several years, there's been and I believe that it's attributable to term limits, there's been a tendency to allow the governor a lot greater executive authority with regard to the budget than I think is appropriate. In the bad old days, before term limits, we would never the governor would not have the degree of flexibility that he has today. I believe that occurred during the Blunt administration when you had a Republican governor and the Republicans in the legislature, and most of them did not know what they were doing, and they just let the governor, it's Republican, so obviously they won't do it wrong. They did it, and they weren't paying attention, and over time, what they did is they ceded a lot of authority. Now, but none of that budget stuff is the stuff I want to talk about. We can deal with that in questions. I want to talk about why you exist. I spend a lot of my time fighting with liberals about what I believe are woolly-headed, silly ideas about government money and government spending. I'm going to do exactly the same thing on the other side of the agenda. There are three big issues, I think, which generally face governmental budget makers. One is, how much money should we raise? Two is, how should we raise that money? And three is, how should we manage whatever it is that we raise? They are, or ought not to be, mixed up together, and yet they invariably are. Take, for instance, the HJR that was a limit on government, HJR 43, that the House considered last week, that was a limitation of government that some people call Tabor. Every single Democrat voted against it because they think it will mean less revenue. Every single Republican voted, except I'm the only Democrat who didn't vote, who voted for it. Every single Republican voted for it because they think it will mean less revenue. I think they are all inaccurate about that. And I think they all did it for the wrong reason. What you should be measuring there is not how much revenue, but how we're managing the revenue. I, in fact, believe that HJR 43 will produce moderate, reasonable growth over a long time rather than radical up and down changes. I could be wrong about that. You know, in fact, Rudy Keller's done some work which suggests that I may be wrong about that, and I'm going to look at that. But the fact of the matter is that's what I think that it does over a long period of time, because I think what you do is you provide for reserve funds, and that's why I like it. I like it because it allows reasonable growth, first of all, and second of all, provides for reserve to take the dips out. Conservatives say, well, what we need to do is limit the government and give the money back. In Missouri, that is so amazingly stupid. You cannot say, no rational person can say to themselves, I believe the government of Missouri has too much money and I am a supporter of the University of Missouri. You can say, I believe the government has too much money and I want to destroy education from kindergarten through graduate school. I believe the government has too much money and I am comfortable with the fact that our mental health system is refrigerator boxes behind the Dipsy dumpster. If you're comfortable with those premises, then it's legitimate to say the government has too much money. But to say the government has too much money and I love my black and gold tie is to just delude yourself intentionally, to make yourself happy. The fact is, the University of Missouri has lost its ability to compete for some NIH grants because of the way we're funding the infrastructure. The University of Missouri has 17,000 more students than it had 15 years ago and has a lot less money. The governor said in his speech that the universities in general can take a cut of $112 million and take it out of, his exact words were, administration and overhead. A, that's false, and B, it's deliberately false and deliberately insulting to the faculty and the staff at the University of Missouri. It is unconscionable. And Republicans say we cannot, it's sinful to raise more money. The cigarette tax is a socialist job-killing proposal. Our cigarette tax is 17 cents. Oklahoma's is $1.10. And when Woody Guthrie drove over the state line, the last socialist left Oklahoma. They don't have a big problem with socialism in Oklahoma, and they're able to get along with a $1.10 cigarette tax. So be for smaller revenue if you like, but then burn your black and gold clothing and quit being self-righteous and hypocritical about it. Now, that's the question of how much revenue we have. We don't have enough, people, and we're killing ourselves. My father and mother were part of the greatest generation. I believe that. My mother was behind German lines for the OSS 4 times. My father jumped, or actually he says got pushed out of helicopters all up through Italy. Not helicopters, airplanes. He's a paratrooper. I went to a tremendous Catholic grade school because they took money and put it in and made that system work. I went to very, very good, small, rural, public high school because they and other people took my little tiny rural school. We had 69 graduates in my school. I had Latin, I had chemistry, I had physics, I had geometry. 100 schools in Missouri don't teach any foreign language. So the next time you look in the mirror and say, how come we have too much money, think about what engineer or doctor is going to take his kids to rural Missouri and put them in a school district where they teach no foreign language. It ain't going to happen. And we're eating our own seed corn. We're destroying ourselves as a society. I have been a consistent supporter of going to a greater degree of dependence on sales tax rather than income tax, because I have, as the liberals say, drunk the Kool-Aid on the subject of, I actually think of the economics being, I think we'll do better as a society economically if we are more reliant on sales tax than income tax. That does not mean that I think that you cannot do that progressively. I believe that those people at the upper end of the income section, including me, ought to be paying some income tax. I believe that people at the bottom end ought to be getting a rebate or a prebate if we go to more sales tax. And I believe if you did those two things, you could rely more heavily on sales tax and have a system that is much more progressive than the one we have now. Remember, we do not have a contest between a regressive sales tax and a regressive income tax in Missouri. Our income tax is also incredibly regressive, so it is between regressive taxes. Besides, regressivity is a true aspect of our tax code, but I believe that it is oversold and overplayed to a significant degree. As to sales taxes, the one thing that makes it overplayed is that food stamps are not taxed with them, and that alone changes the matrix very, very significantly. The tax proposal that my friend is supporting, I think, is A, cannot pass, and B, is bad for the state of Missouri. It's bad for the state of Missouri because it will produce less revenue and because it moves the burden so substantially downward. It will not pass because there's enough people in the middle. I think radical things don't happen. If we're going to move toward sales tax, we have to do so gradually, and we have to do so in a responsible way. Conservatives very often like the sales tax, not because they like the philosophy, but because they think it'll mean less revenue. You've got to separate how you're going to get the money, sales or income tax, from how much money. We don't have enough money. And to mix those two things together is self-defeating. We need more revenue. I would like more sales tax, but I would like it to, and I would like some income tax, and I'd like all the income tax to be at the upper end, and I would like prebates at the lower end. Management, I think we should take the
1 minute, Chris.
The ebbs and flows out of the government and provide money in the kitty so that we have it flattened out. And we will not do that absent some constitutional control. I will be happy to answer any questions along with the Senator. Thank you very much. Yeah, Mike.
So there's a trade-off between these tax incentives and tax credits and marginal tax rates. The more of those deductions you have, the higher your marginal tax rate. You guys, and that's an issue in the revenues we're raising. And so can you talk about your philosophy on tax credits and tax incentives and what you would see as a possible reform?
Let me start there. For this year, it's about $650 million in tax credits. So it's about $650 million in revenue that we're foregoing with the tax credits that we issue. I think we need to review those. You know, some of the smaller ones, the social ones, food pantry tax credit, which is a relatively small amount of money, it expired this year. I have a bill to renew that. I mean, Peggy Kirkpatrick, with every $1 in tax credit that goes out the door, she can buy 20 pounds of food. It's a relatively small amount. I think historic preservation and some of the others that are over $100 million a year, we absolutely have to look at that. I mean, here's the issue. Right now, I mean, the governor withheld $57 million. He is withholding over $57 million from K through 12 for transportation. We literally have school districts in this state that cannot afford diesel fuel in buses. I like the historic preservation program, but in a time like this, you've got to balance it. Are you really going to put $100 million into redoing historic buildings when you can't get kids on the school bus to school? There's got to be some balance there, and I think we have to, you know, we've got to address that. I do want to comment also on what Chris said as far as a consumption tax, because I ran out of time. I mean, I like the idea of a consumption tax. I like the idea of taxing consumption rather than production. The thing is, you do have to adjust for the regressivity of it. I think you can do that, though, with how you, I mean, there's a lot of options on that. You can actually give out cards that people actually waive sales tax up to a certain amount. My biggest concern with the proposal is that, as I said when I spoke previously, we're $1 billion down in general revenue. This year alone, it's a $500 million shortfall from the previous year, and it scares the bejesus out of me what's going to happen if we phase into this and we have a substantial dip in general revenue. Because let me tell you what else is going on at the exact same time. Under the new federal health care law, when that kicks in about 2 years, a year and a half, we have 410,000 more Missourians that are going to go on Medicaid overnight. 410,000. That is at least another $1 billion commitment out of discretionary general revenue from the state of Missouri. And I can tell you right now, if that happens, where that money's coming from. It's going to come from K through 12 and higher ed because it's the only place that's big enough for it to come from. Here's the bigger problem. And Chris and I mean, you know, I've said this before. I think the two of us have probably passed more legislation in the last 3 years than any other Senate or representative combination. You know, we work very well together, but there are some things we disagree on. And one thing about the whole idea of we need more revenue, we have to generate more revenue, the half of the equation that's not being discussed is in the last 3 years, appropriations from the state of Missouri for Medicaid have increased by $1.6 billion. So if you want to know where the money's going, that's where it's going. I don't think that you can necessarily have a discussion about bringing in new revenue when you're not talking about the fact that there's a program out there that nobody seems to want to talk about that is consuming the largest part of where the revenue increase would be going and is going right now. I think there's a balance there. I mean, I think one reason we get along so well is we talk all the time. I think communication is a critical part of that. And we debate these things. Just like we come here and we speak to you, we sit down in our offices and we talk about this stuff, and usually by the end of the conversation, we've come up with some agreements on some things. That's how it's supposed to work. This is supposed to be an exchange of ideas. You know, on the consumption tax, again, I think it's a very intriguing idea. I'm very concerned about what happens when it phases in, especially during the phase in, and whether or not we have a substantial dip in general revenue. Because we cannot take it right now.
It's hard to debate with him. He makes this big damn long speeches. Nobody's willing to say, up there say, well, Medicaid's increasing, but nobody says, and the option is to pitch them on the street. Whereas a society, we're past that decision. We're not going to do that. In fact, I think that the health care bill is going to result in less, not more spending for the state, because the federal government's going to pick up such a big share. Conservatives have their minds trained to think that it's going to be bad. Why? Because Obama did it, and he's the president. We don't like him. You know, I thought of something. We should have the great genius of Barack Obama. What he has done well is he has taught Republicans that there is a second member of the Articles, or the Bill of Rights. The Republicans all knew about the Second Amendment. But since Obama's been elected, they learned about the 10th Amendment. They didn't know about it before, but they learned about it when he became president. This means that we need 8 more Democratic presidents for them to learn the rest of the Bill of Rights. They might, for instance, have the same seriousness about the right to a jury trial that they have to the right to bear arms. Tax credits, I didn't answer the question at all. Everybody hates them until they love them. And if they're in their district, they love them. It's the nature of the beast. Besides which, they work in some instances. Some of us are old enough to remember Pruitt-Igoe. We are past, which is a big public housing project in St. Louis. We are past the place where the society is going to reconsider whether we spend money on public housing. We are going to. Whether you like that or don't like that is irrelevant. The fact is, we as a society are going to do that. The question then becomes how. The straight governmental expenditure in Pruitt-Igoe proved to be a massive disaster. 100% of people would agree with that. Right over there is Bethel, built with tax credits. It is a good, clean, safe, enjoyable place for low-income seniors to live. And the terrible thing about it from the perspective of some liberals is somebody makes money. That ain't a wrong thing. Second, the person owns it, and they'll own it in 20 years, and so they keep it up. There is a societal benefit. What we have done is, it's a classic productive public-private partnership. So, are some of them abusive? Yeah. Are some of them wonderfully productive? Yes. Yes.
Question, I guess, for both of you. Given that Missouri's growth in gross state product is now 48th out of 50, and we're probably headed to last place, and I think it has a lot to do with our tax structure, how would you feel about a gradual conversion to a consumption tax from an income tax if it could be guaranteed that at every step of the way it is revenue neutral?
Let me take that first. Because, all right, another thing that you touched on there on the number being 48th, federal government put out data the week of January 25th that shows of all 50 states, at the end of 2011, Missouri is #1 out of 50 in job loss. We lost 11,800 jobs in December alone, and that's adjusted for seasonal variation. Those are mostly manufacturing jobs. That's the problem. The problem is we have no growth. I mean, the point is, how do you fix this? And I'll give you a good example. We had The proposed director, the proposed new director for the Department of Economic Development was before the Senate Appropriations Committee last week because we were going through their budget. They're asking for about $240 million in appropriation authority for economic development programs. And I let them get through about 6 or 7 programs in their budget. It was $7 million here, $10 million there, $30 million there, and then I stopped them and I pulled out those articles. And I said, okay, you're asking us for this authority. You probably already asked us just in these lines alone for 60, 70 million. You're asking for $240 million roughly. I brought up the articles. I said Missouri at the end of 2011 was #1 in job loss. You want this money. Why should we give it to you, and what are we doing wrong? And the director, the proposed director, at least as of last week, looked at me in silence for a moment and said, I can't tell you. I don't know. That's the problem. Should we have the discussion about whether or not it's the tax system? I think the tax system is part of it. I think there's a lot of other things that need to be fixed as well. I think I would be much more comfortable with it if I actually saw data that showed that through a transition period you would not have a decline in general revenue and that overall it would be sustainable. Again, you'd have to address the regressivity too, but that's just bureaucracy. That's just the way you carry it out, and I think that can be addressed.
All this business about lower taxes are going to result in greater economic development growth. Last year, we cut the franchise tax, right? This year, where are the jobs? No jobs. Cut the franchise tax, $80 million. The floor was full this, we're going to cut the franchise tax, and 1,000 flowers are going to bloom. We got moss. You know, we didn't get no new flowers. Besides, when I was a kid in the 50s, huge, big, powerful unions, right? Big, big, high tax rates. And everybody was making a living. No unions now, taxes are down now, and everybody's starving. So, it's hard to blame it on unions and taxes. I mean, you sit down with most of the members and show me people who pay dues. Unions and taxes are the problem. Well, when I was president, neither unions nor taxes were the problem, were they? Now, you could find lots of reasons why that's not true, but the fact of the matter is, unions and taxes have not demonstrated that they're the problem. You don't like them because they're part of the can't. The same way that liberals don't like some things that I am equally as critical of, because it's part of this, I can't think about that or my mind will explode. The fact is, when you're having big, huge corporate entities, you need a countervailing power in the society, or they will run rampant. It's a danger. It's a real danger. Huge, unrestrained corporate activity represents some danger to the liberty of the citizen. The union is one reasonable counterweight to that. Or would you rather have a more powerful government as the counterweight?
Yes, your comment on the loss of jobs is direct on the point. But the correlation that causes that out-migration of jobs is a little issue called economic freedom. And there's a great correlation between the amount of economic freedom that any state or government or location enjoys and its migration of workers, its job creations, etc. Missouri ranks a dismal 26th in North America by the Fraser Institute on economic freedom. Two important key categories of that, components that make up that economic freedom index. The Pacific Research Institute says Missouri is 44th worst in relative size of government. They are 36th worst in the relative size of regulations. Yet we keep pounding on and pouring on more regulations. Senator, one of your current, you said you have a lot of other legislation. One of your current bills is a jobs killer. You have a bill, 651, is going to create a new occupational licensing category for home inspectors. Mm-hmm. It's a jobs killer. All the studies demonstrated, yes, you're the lobbyists and the people that's coming after you, the realtors and those people that want to provide that economic protection for that occupancy or that occupation group are lobbying for it. But it's a jobs killer. So we keep increasing regulations and we're going to keep destroying jobs and we're going to put up more no working signs by boards and commissions and people are going to migrate out of the state. It isn't just taxes, it isn't just unions, It isn't just corporations. It is, those two things are big job killers. Now, taking issue with your on unions, anytime government gives any entity more power than it would otherwise have under contract law, like you do with unions, and give them more power, it's like the realtor. First realtor show up at your house, puts a sign that says, "I'm your real estate agent. You can't go negotiate with somebody else." And that's what unions do, and they're job killers.
That is such amazing dribble, and here's why. The corporate entity came into existence by virtue of governmental activity. It is not something that exists in nature. It is something that grew through government. And it is good that it did. If we did not prevent the corporate entity from, if there was unlimited liability, we could not have had the corporate activity that we had in this country, which allowed the 1,000 economic flowers to bloom. However, that corporate entity is undeniably a creature of and a child of governmental activity. The union, on the other hand, in its most pristine form, is a completely private association of people who work for a living. Why one likes the governmental activity of the big corporation, but not the private association of working people to counterbalance it, is beyond me.
The union, I'm not against the union, it's the power that the government gives the union in contract negotiations. Unions are great. I'm for any kind of association. I'm for 50 unions within an organization. 150 or whatever. It's the power that the government, I'm against the power that the government gives to corporations as well, that is extraordinary to their normal contract powers.
Did you want to respond?
Yeah, you know, I think there's less than 1,000 home inspectors. Right now, I could go out right now and put up a sign and say I'm a home inspector. I'm going to charge you $500 to come and inspect your home. They are completely unregulated. But you rely on them when you buy a house because they inspect your home and you want to look and are there any structural issues? No. I have a personal experience with that. I used a home inspector 10 years ago, bought my house. Great. Everything's good. Literally after I closed, I had $3,000 worth of stuff that I had to pay for right away. Look, do I think it's going to kill the economy of the state of Missouri to require a home inspector to actually register and show they have some qualification to be a home inspector? No. Do I think that regulations overall are hurting the economy of the state of Missouri? Yes, I do. I don't think that's one. We've got a bill in the Senate right now that would sunset all regulations in the state of Missouri on a rolling basis, except for those that are then reauthorized. That's what we need to do. We've got a lot of stuff on the books. I mean,
Which will cost millions of dollars.
Probably will.
And will make us review lots of regulations. These I hate regulations guys, like my friend here, won't name the regulations they hate. I like, for instance, a lot of regulations, and so do you. Lots and lots of them. Yes, sir.
I feel like asking for some tea rather than coffee, because what I'm hearing is a lot of what strikes me as unprincipled and short-sighted comments. For example, you think you give more money to public schools in Missouri, they're going to teach foreign languages? Like hell. They'll spend it the way they want to spend it. You give more money to the campus, are they going to do necessarily the good things? No. Why mess around with the tax code? Why don't you just look at taxes as a means of raising revenue, and if you want to do something with the money, do it in a separate bill. Otherwise,
we do that. That's my
you
initial
just have
point.
sneaky ways of doing things. And you know, why is it? Isn't the big problem that we only have 1/3 of the state revenues available, and that 2/3 are committed?
No, it isn't.
It helps the leadership.
You can't do anything.
That's
the
not,
1/3. You can't do anything about it. What do you think? I mean, Medicaid, which is over $3 billion, the federal government says you're either in or you're out. If you're in, you're going to pay 40% of everything that we say you have to pay for. We have no discretion in that. I can't say, well, you know what? To hell with you. I'm just going to pay for what I want to pay for. We would be out of the Medicaid program. You know,
Medicaid isn't 2/3 of the budget now. It's 2/3 of revenues, is it?
federal spending is about 1/3.
yeah.
Non-general revenue state spending, conservation, highways, those kinds of things, is about another 1/3. Kurt's
Right.
absolutely right about the 1/3, 1/3, 1/3. we can't, if you don't like the fact that the Highway Commission or the Conservation Commission are separate entities, that's fine, change it. But the fact
That's what I'm
is,
saying.
we've got to live in the real world. We don't live in this fantasy land where, oh, well, you know, it's wrong, so therefore we should ignore it. We have to live in the world which says highway money is dedicated, conservation money is dedicated, and lots of other money is dedicated. I wish that were not true in a lot of ways, but it is true. It's the real world.
If we had absolute discretion over the entire $23 billion budget, we absolutely would do things differently. But again, we only have discretion. We only have control to say where about 1/3 of that money goes. $7.3 billion this year.
Do both parties generally agree with the position that you two clearly agree on? Is it you ought to have more discretion over the entire pot of money?
I don't think so.
I don't think so.
So most people like it the way it is.
No,
Well,
most people don't think about
I
it.
think a lot of Democrats like it. And I'll give you an example. Medicaid is set up the way it's set up, so that states don't have discretion. It's so the federal government can tell you what you're going to spend money on. Because the core budget, which is most of it for Medicaid, that's what we can't do anything with. There are some ancillary Medicaid programs on the fringes that we do have discretion on. But that's why when Governor Blunt was the governor, and we had a shortfall, and there had to be some cuts made, they made cuts in those ancillary programs in Medicaid that we could. You can't cut the budget, or the core budget, but you can cut the ancillaries. Well, what do you think those ancillaries are? They're wheelchair batteries. They're all those things that the federal government said, yeah, we'll give you the discretion on that, but let's see you do it. Well, Missouri did it, and I mean, we had a lot of people who really had a hard time with that. You had people who, who suffered on the receiving end, and people who made the hard decision and took a lot of grief for that too. But that's the design of the system. I cannot change that.
It was a vicious and calculated decision.
I have.
You could talk about it.
Look, and Chris said, leave people on the side of the road. There are populations in this society that absolutely have to have assistance, whether you like it or not. We are a civilized society, and we're not throwing everybody to the side of the road. Should we have discretion as a state to say how we do that? Absolutely. The money that we send to D.C., we send our money, our federal dollars to D.C., they attach those restrictions, and they say you're only going to get it back if you do what we say. That is what's wrong. If we could get all of our Medicaid money, including that core funding, and block grants.
If we could get 2/3 of it without the regulation, I'd be a happy camper.
Absolutely.
And
but not everybody agrees with that.
You know how many Republicans are going to support that in Washington? 0. Let me give you a specific. Republicans talk about regulations in the abstract. By far, the #1 most expensive regulation in all of education is the demand of full inclusion in the public schools of handicapped children, right? And by federal regs, and the federal government promised to cover 40% of the cost of doing that, and they've never reached 12%. That regulation costs state and local governments a fortune, and there is not one single Republican in the Congress who will vote to repeal it. Not one. Because it is politically popular that we mainstream and do all that inclusion. What it means is children are in classrooms with ventilators taking an entire teacher, separate teacher, to take care of that one child. Now, is that a good use of our money? Or would it be better if the states were making that decision? I think it would be far better if states would be making that decision. But not one Republican will vote to repeal. That's incredibly unpopular. I am the only politician that I've ever heard say the rigidity of that regulation is destructive, terribly destructive to American education. And no Republican will join me in that. Then that's the most expensive one, and it is the one that they all mean in the back of their heads, but will never look you in the eye and say they will repeal it.
I think we have time for one more question.
Donna? Hi, Donna.
With the addition of, I think you said 400 million to Medicaid, if Obama's health care goes through?
410,000 new people.
Okay, 410,000. What do you do? Lift the, or do you know what will happen, or where these people will come from? Or?
We know who the people are. Right now, I mean, we do have discretion in setting the threshold eligibility for Medicaid. We're at about 20% of the federal poverty level. We are as low as the federal government will let us go in setting that threshold. What happens under the new health care law, we are forced to go from the 20% of the federal poverty level to 135%. That jump overnight represents 410,000 more people. The money's going to come from one of two places. We're either going to cut someplace else. As I said, when you've got those two big pots of money in general revenue, the only other one that's big enough to get that much money is education, both K through 12 and higher ed, or you've got to have a revenue increase. And the thing is, the type of revenue increase that you would have to maintain that is insane. I mean, we're not talking about just a minor revenue increase. It's massive. Now, Chris did mention the federal government said, well, we're going to take on the additional cost of that. What that really means is we're still the same for the existing Medicaid patients. The new 410,000, for 3 years, the federal government pays 90% for the extra, the new ones, and after 3 years, all bets are off.
Hey, Chris, you said Obamacare was going to save money. Can you explain that?
I think that because in the first 3 years, I don't know after the first 3 years, but for the first 3 years, the feds will pick up such a substantial portion of the money that it will be, it will save money to the society in general, I think. If we do some of the efficiencies that we ought to do, the cost, the big drivers in Medicaid costs are the number of people, as Kurt says, and the corruption. The corruption in the system is huge, and there's not anywhere near as much. There is some recipient corruption, but there's a tremendous amount of provider corruption also.
You think the feds are going to fix corruption?
No, I don't. That's why Kurt is right when he says he wants to give the authority to states. The same way with education. I'm different than Rick Perry in that I know what 3 federal departments I closed. And the first would be education, not because I don't agree with many of the goals of the education, but because the federal government is so comprehensively incompetent through Democrats and Republicans in dealing with the problem. I would be delighted with 2/3 of the money and none of the regulation. We would do a far, far better job in education.
Well, on behalf of the Show Me Institute, I want to extend our gratitude to Senator Schaefer and Representative Kelly. We really appreciate that.